So I would love to ask our panel to come join us. We'll get seated and then start talking about everyone's backgrounds. Here, thanks. Okay. So I know that we've sent you bios as well, but let's do these kind of one at a time. Amanda, do you want to start, and we'll work closer to me, and I reserve my right to edit and rebut your biographical sketch.
Sure. So some career background kind of.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So I am co-founder and CEO of a company called Food 52, and I did not begin my career as an entrepreneur. I actually began as a cook, and I cooked in Europe. In a bunch of countries, and then I found that I wanted to write, and so I started writing, and ended up at the New York Times, where I stayed for 11 years as a food reporter and editor. I wrote a bunch of books, and while that might seem an unconventional way to that would lead to starting a company, actually, when you're a journalist, your job is really to, especially in kind of my area of journalism, is to really kind of like see what is happening down the road and like connect the dots for people, like see what's coming, and then tell those stories and report out those stories. And so it was very much a mindset that I had around my domain, which was like what is happening in food and what is interesting and what's needed. And so I sort of I have I along the way met my friend Meryl. We worked on a book project for 5 years, and then we decided to start this company. And the reason we did was because of what we were seeing in the food world, but also like just what we were feeling as consumers. It's sort of like the classic founder story of like, I want this, so I'm going to create it. And that, for us, that meant creating this world where you could, that was very community driven, where you could get really high quality content, and also buy things that you needed, like meet other people, and have it all very nicely like kind of integrated and curated in one place. And really to sort of shift from seeing like food as this niche thing, like this kitchen as if the kitchen has traditionally been treated as like this other part of your house, when it's actually like the center of your house. And to sort of see someone's interest in food as something broader. It's really about how you live in your life. I think my microphone might have just went wonky, but anyway, I'll try to talk loudly. And so we felt like that was what was happening, is that Americans were kind of like making this shift, and we wanted to be the place that they were drawn to, that they would go to as a resource for everything in their cooking and home life. And so we started this company, Food 52. It took us, so we're 10 years in, and we just sold a majority stake to the Chernin Group. So we've just crossed a pretty significant milestone.
And when you say you were working on a book project with Meryl, you wrote a New York Times bestseller called The New York Times Cookbook.
Yeah. Well, I actually, and it's I'm getting to the age where and now actually I'm doing the 10-year anniversary edition. So I don't recommend trying to complete a book while you're also closing an investment.
Yeah. And win any James Beard awards?
Yes, I did. Yeah.
Get appointed by any presidents to anything?
Yes, I did.
Play yourself in a major motion picture with
Yes,
Meryl Streep?
Yes, I had the perfect Hollywood career. I got the part. It was a successful movie, and I'm out.
Okay, so I knew that I was going to need to reserve a little time to rebut your biographical sketch. And one last question, then we'll move on. But so you were the food editor of the New York Times Magazine,
Yep.
Which is kind of the job you want as a food writer, period. And then you said, let me go and become unemployed and do a startup.
I have a very generous husband who was very patient. So I did that. I was 36, I guess, ish.
Do you miss?
I'm in the ish era. Where we don't need to get into the details.
Do you miss having the ability to be part of that kind of project at the New York Times?
No, I don't. Because the New York Times is like an amazing place, and I'm so glad I work there. But like, you have to like working at a corporation and bureaucracy, and I'm so not like. And probably almost everyone in this room is not like that.
You'd rather be the bureaucracy at the corporation.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good. All right. Well, congrats again on the
Thank you.
on the deal.
Thank you. Thank you. Couldn't have done it without you. Seriously.
Steph.
Hi, I'm Stephanie Palmieri. I'm a partner at a fund in San Francisco and the Bay Area called Uncork Capital. Some of you may know us through our previous name, which was SoftTech VC. We changed the name just about exactly 2 years ago. I'm originally from the East Coast. I spent a decade here working in marketing, consulting, technology, and then I moved to the Bay Area, and I'm in my 9th year now there and investing with the fund. We're a seed stage fund. We invest exclusively in the earliest stages. We're currently investing out of our, well, actually, we're probably about to be investing out of our 6th fund. We're kind of in that position, that crossover position of moving from the last $100 million fund into the new $100 million fund we just closed. And we just raised our 2nd growth fund, which only invests in opportunities that are in the existing portfolio. So when we do growth stage opportunities, they're following on to the growth rounds of our seed investments that we supported. I lead deals across a wide variety of areas, but I do pretty much all of the consumer and marketplaces that the firm does, I lead. And then about half of what I do falls into kind of SaaS or B2B.
So I want to go back to high school for you. I'm not looking for chronology, just you kind of had this interesting high school career, which you can't really draw a straight line from that to where you are.
I went to a, are any of you, I mean, I have to assume in this room, when I say this in California, like no one raises their hand. How many of you are from New Jersey? Oh, wow, that's great, awesome. So I grew up in Monmouth County.
No one says that either when people raise their hands in New Jersey.
I always say New York. Awesome. The hard part is I always say I'm from New York, and then my husband looks at me and he's like, "You're not from New York." I'm like, consider myself a New Yorker. No, I grew up in the Jersey Shore, and I went to this very obscure science high school called the Marine Academy of Science and Technology, which was a magnet school in Monmouth County, and on Sandy Hook, so it's like the northernmost beach. And so it was a combination of like marine sciences, so I took like oceanography and marine biology, and the Navy. And so I wore a Navy uniform twice a week, had a sword, and I very easily could have had a military career if I wanted to, but I chose to go a different path.
And have you thought about like using the sword? Do you still?
So I was actually in Japan this summer and did a ninja class. So I did get a chance, or a samurai class. So I did get a chance to swing a sword and do some real serious. It was a lot sharper than the sword that I had in high school. They were smart to give us swords in high school that were a little dull. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, my kids who just finished high school.
I should say I do still have the uniform with all the badges, and I busted it out for Halloween on occasion.
Yeah, that can't be allowed. I'm pretty sure.
Well, it's not a real military. It's a junior ROTC uniform. So it's not. I'm not impersonating like a real military officer. Plus it was my uniform. It has my name on it. So.
I'm going to leave that there.
Okay.
Excellent. And last question is, so you worked in a startup in New York. You went to Columbia for the MBA program. You spent maybe a little shy of a decade here before moving out to the Bay Area. And you were employee number what at the fund?
I guess technically, it depends on how. Like technically, I was employee number 4 at the fund. We had our founder Jeff. We had an operations manager who at the time was Jeff CA, who's now our head of operations, Ashley, and then our partner Charles Hudson, who's no longer a partner at the firm. So I have like the second longest tenure at the firm and the longest tenure as an investor, other than obviously our founder. But I followed Ashley and Charles in the fund.
But do you think of it as being a bit like joining a risky
startup? Oh yeah, it was definitely. So the best way to put it is when I joined the firm, we were going from a model of there being a solo founder, solo GP, to a small investment team going from $15 million invested in relatively, I mean, there's still small checks relative to what some of the folks on stage and in the audience might write, but we were writing 200K checks in companies to moving up towards writing $1 million checks in companies and taking leadership positions. So when I think about the time I joined, like there was not a lot of infrastructure. We had to put processes around everything we were doing because we were going from what was in one individual's brain to being a team of investors. So it's very entrepreneurial, and like a lot of the things I did, on the operating side, and I wasn't brought in to be an operator, but when you're in a small fund, you wear all of the hats, and we still do wear all of the hats. A lot of those, it's cool to see a lot of those programs. We just had our 8th annual Founders Summit this year, where we had 120 Uncork founders in Napa, along with 40 or so of our LPs and smaller investors. And it's crazy to see how that's grown. I mean, that wasn't even feasible when I started, so it's cool.
That is cool.
Yeah.
And Amy, less than a year ago, you were the CFO of a company with $2 billion plus in revenue.
Yeah, turned up and went full circle back into growth investing. So I was at Discovery. So my career was, it was really enjoyable being on both sides of the table. So I started my career in venture at Insight Venture Partners. Briefly went to IA Ventures, tried out early stage investing, and then went back into growth. I was CFO at NewsCred, was there for 4 years with Shopbot, New York company, and then I did corporate media, so Discovery for almost 2 years, and was based in Singapore as CFO and COO there before coming back and was CFO of the direct-to-consumer and sports business before coming back to venture.
And your bio also talks about, and I mean, so you and I met when you were a junior person at Insight.
Yeah, so long ago.
And I know that you climb, and your bio talks a little bit about your climbing. Do you want to just give us a minute of what you're doing when you're climbing, or what kinds of things you've climbed?
Yeah, I love alpine mountaineering, and I think I climbed Mount Shasta earlier this year, and it was the 16th alpine summit that I was able to do the last 8 years. So if anyone in your audience also shares that interest, love to chat with you guys about it.
And do you just not get sick at altitude? Is that a big part of what enables you to do it?
I think everyone gets sick, but I think I'm just able to just grit through it a little bit harder than some other people.
All right.
Yeah, but I'm an investment partner at Lightspeed now, based in San Francisco, Bay Area, and so Lightspeed is a full cycle fund. Do early stage, Series A, kind of institutional seed, all the way through pre-IPO. I'm an investor on the growth team, so one of three partners, and we invest out of 2 vehicles, $3 billion growth funds, kind of early to late stage growth, and I cover U.S., India, and China consumer and enterprise investments. So I joined earlier this year, led my first 2 investments, kind of like at the 2 ends of growth, Series E round of ThoughtSpot, BI analytics company, and then the Series B round of Indian-based merchant B2B bookkeeping platform.
So I just want to recap for 1 sec, because I think you said you cover the U.S., India, and China?
Growth investments, correct.
Growth in consumer and enterprise. And I
fairly
can't
general.
help but notice that that's not narrow.
It's quite broad, it's true.
So how do you think about, and we're going to get into this when we do the questions from the founders, how do you think about narrowing your lens and what things you're going to respond to, given that you have an enormous mandate?
Yeah, I spend probably 60% of my time on U.S. investments, and then for India and China, I mean, these are big markets with a lot of venture activity right now, and we're very fortunate because Lightspeed actually has teams on the ground in India, China, Israel, and Europe, in addition to the U.S. And so I work very closely with our early stage teams in India and China, and so we collaborate when it comes to growth investing, both rounds into the early stage portfolio that they've invested in, but also new growth rounds. And so if it weren't for them, I wouldn't be able to cover all 3 geos for sure. But that's how we were able to get a lot of leverage in the fund.
All right. Well, we're happy to have you visiting New York often, I hope.
Every month, I'm here. A lot of great companies here.
Excellent. Mike, you want to tell us a bit about your background?
Sure. So my name is Mike Ciccone. I'm the co-founder and CEO of a company named Button. And Button is a platform with a really ambitious goal. What we're trying to do is create a better way to do business in mobile. What that means is the internet economy that we've all come to know and rely upon is fueled by advertising. And we think that there is a better way. We think that you will see an internet powered by actions, not ads, in the future. And if you want to think about what that means, if you look east and you look to what the Chinese digital economy has created, a lot of companies you probably look and admire, it's not an ad-dependent economy. And what I mean by that is most of what is built in that market and what I think we all can learn from are transactional-based business models. If you look at the WeChat business, most of their revenue actually comes from commerce and from payments, not from advertising. And I know most people, if you do a survey of a room like this and say, like, do you love ads? Like, no one raises their hands, right? And so the reality is, we think that there's a better way that companies can make money through driving commerce and through driving actionability on top of their properties. And so that's what we set out to build 5 years ago. The company is now 150 people. We're based here in New York. All of our engineers are here in the United States, in New York City, which is incredibly expensive, but delightful. They're all close.
Do you think that's more expensive than having engineers in San Francisco?
It's not more expensive, but it is near.
Yeah.
It is nearly as expensive.
Do you think you'd have more churn
If I
on
were
your engineers if they were in San Francisco?
100%.
So when you factor that in, you want to reconsider the expense?
It's a great way to ask the question.
Am I leading the witness a little
You
bit?
are leading the witness, so I love you. But I will tell you, I think I wouldn't change what we did. I love New York, and I've always said to people that I consider the Hudson and the East River my moat, where I protect my engineers. And I mean that. Our tenure at our company is sub 5% turnover, and that's on an annual basis, and that's a pretty remarkable stat for a 150-person company. So I think what you see here with the engineering profiles is actually a willingness to stay longer, to be with companies for longer than you see in San Francisco. And you tend to see senior engineers willing to take those bets and be with companies for longer term. So I think it's a benefit all in all. At the same time, we are right now investing in building some operations elsewhere.
And you don't want to say where elsewhere is?
Well, I'll say a couple. One company named Indela, which I know you know, a very inspiring business that is dedicated to helping people in Africa be able to have empowerment and opportunities to bring them outside of the economy there, is empowering a wave of engineers to come and support companies anywhere. And so we're working with Indela to onboard a few engineers there in Nigeria, and then we're looking at a few other locations for them.
Cool. And you started and sold a prior company, and that led to a job with the buyer. Do you want to talk briefly about that?
Yeah, so before Button, we had run a company, a couple buddies of mine, and we'd sold it to a big Japanese internet company named Rakuten. Show of hands, who knows Rakuten now? Awesome. 5 years ago, like 20 hands would have gone up. And it's a pretty remarkable story what they've invested in to make their name more known. What we had built was a platform that was helping initially a very altruistic cause. I won't bore you with all the details, but we were trying to help nonprofits raise money and doing so digitally, allowing people to support Susan G. Komen by searching online, shopping online, any microtransaction that you took online, whether it's an advertisement view or a search that you would query, we would be able to take a little bit of that money and donate it to a cause. And felt really good, and it sucked as a business model. So we ended up pivoting slightly, and when we pivoted, had a lot more success. There's this kind of age-old lesson in sociology or psychology that there's no interest like self-interest, and how we manifest that in this business was we turned that micro donation to a cause into a value for the consumer taking the action in the form of digital currencies for games, to airline miles or cash back or whatever, everyone's obsessed with these things. And funny enough, when we did that, the business exploded. And so Rakuten, which had a really big loyalty ecosystem, saw our platform as a really powerful way to broaden the touch points with consumers and generate revenue. And so that business is still flourishing. They call it the cash cow. And it's still flourishing in Japan. So we sold the company, and then I was there for 4 years after.
Doing?
Running that business, which was global and a lot of fun, but then also leading investments for them. And so got to have a purview into a lot of the markets you've been studying, because Rakuten at that point had a really wide mandate. And the CEO had kind of taken me under his wing to go and lead exciting new investments into new territory and new categories for them. And so got to do some really cool and big deals and returned a fair amount of profit for him. But I texted him and asked him about my carry, and he's never responded.
But they're doing stuff with you at Button.
Yeah, so we're partners with them right now.
So he is responding.
So he's responding. He's responding.
Okay.
We invested in Pinterest, and that was $100 million. It's a big return. It was more than $1 billion.
Did you help him pass on WeWork, or?
I did not have any involvement with that.
Okay. All right. So I've got, so before this session, the founders in the current vintage and we met to talk about the issues that are on their desks. And we asked them to give us questions that we should pose to these great people on the panel so that they didn't have to. So I am going to be their instrument for some of these. So want to start with explaining how founders should think about investors who are reaching out to them cold. We had a fairly robust discussion in which a number of the folks in the room felt like they were getting their LinkedIn outreach positively responded to, and I might just be a terrible person because I don't really respond that much to the LinkedIn outreach, but I'd love to hear how that's working, and we've got multiple sides of the table here because you folks have been investors and founders and also very successful and visible professionals who were getting outreach from people just seeking advice. So when investors are out of network, how do you get to them? What's effective?
Is the question, should they reach out cold, or is the question how to get to
when they
folks
have to reach out
when you
cold?
have to reach out
when
cold?
you have to reach out cold, what the hell do you do?
Assuming there is no way for you to find a node that you are connected, I think the best thing is to write a very, very thoughtful email, very specific to your business and what your ask is. I still think that is a very difficult strategy because at seed, the volume is so high that breaking through the noise of my inbox or my colleague's inbox is quite challenging. And, to make an email stand out amongst all of that with no other differentiation is difficult. I will say, I don't think we've ever invested in a company that's come to us cold. However, on occasion, we will take the occasional phone screener meeting. And recently I got an email in my inbox. It actually wasn't a good fit for me. I read it and I was like, actually this feels like a good fit for one of my partners. I sent it along to Andy, and Andy's like, oh, this is a problem that a lot of the companies that I work with are having, so I do want to learn more, so he asked the founder to see a deck, right? So that's, to me, there was enough information in that email for me to say, hey, is it interesting to learn a little bit more? It may not get to a meeting, but at least it kind of cracked the door open. So, as specific as possible as you can be, give investors the amount of information they can use to make a decision. Vague does not work.
Yeah, I have a philosophy around it that started with IA and then continued with Lightspeed. Is I actually respond to every single email. and also LinkedIn outreach.
Sorry, what did you say your email address was?
You're in trouble.
Honestly, I just think that being a founder is so hard, and it's just the least I can do to just respond and give them the courtesy of a response. And I've actually made a lot of
But do you take meetings? Because I mean, I reply like this isn't a fit for us. But do you
Yeah.
actually meet with the company? Like
Sometimes, like if it's a high quality meeting, and sometimes with growth deals actually, right? They come from different channels. Some of them are banks, some of them are through most are through warm intros, but some are actually cold, and they're like, I know that you've invested in these companies, and I'm specifically seeking you out for your expertise, and I certainly will respond. Or most of the time, actually, it's early stage companies ping me, and sometimes I'll send it to my seed investor friends or other investors, and so I really try to be helpful because I just know how hard it is on the other side of the table. But I actually think, unfortunately, very few investors have that philosophy, and so most people actually don't respond to a lot of them. Definitely would recommend the warm intro, but persistence even with cold intros, you are.
So I'm going to pause here for a minute because I wonder how much of this is a function of your newer role at Lightspeed and your growth mandate, which should limit the amount of seed outreach you get. And I'm just gonna, because I see both Rachel Lamb and Keith Titan in this part of the room, and they're both really nice people who are long-term early stage investors. The two of you can't possibly respond to all of the outreach, right?
Of course we do.
For those on this side of the room, that was an "of course we do," which did not sound at all convincing. Rachel?
At Time Warner, I had a team, and yes, we used to slightly, and I did do an investment from over the fence, but now to Imagination Capital, no. I think that a warm intro and more information versus less, if you're going to try to approach through LinkedIn, with a deck is helpful for me to figure out whether it is, I don't have much of a team, and so yes, a warm intro, more information, a deck that actually is somewhat compelling is pretty.
Yeah, and I'm not saying that you're wrong, just that you're a little unique and that they're nice people too. And I think it's.
I mean, the problem is though, like even if I respond and say, thanks, this isn't a fit for us, that really doesn't help you, right? I mean, because you're like, if every early stage investor has a template probably that says, thanks, this isn't a fit for the fund, right?
Yeah.
Like we all use super, like there's just an easy and we may give you a line or two about why it's not a fit. But the reality is, I could easily get a couple hundred relatively cold emails in a month. That so that I don't have enough time to meet with all those guys. So what you need to do is you need to get to a meeting. If you don't get to a meeting, it doesn't matter if I respond, no, this isn't a fit for you. Like you actually need to get at a minimum a phone screen.
So Amanda, can you talk a little bit about raising the first 2 or 3 rounds at seed stage for Food 52 and what you did to kind of knock down doors?
Well, so I was just thinking about I remember a feeling, especially in the first round, was, and I think this is where I worry about the idea that you have to have a warm intro, is that my co-founder and I were moms in our 30s, with very different non-business career backgrounds. And we used to kind of joke about should we start wearing sneakers and jeans and pullovers, because it was very clear that any event we went to, and I mean I think as investors you guys probably feel you may feel this way also, but it's different now. But even 10 years ago, we just didn't fit in, and we in fact I got kicked out of a founders group because I wasn't my company wasn't real enough. It was too early stage.
Wait.
It's true.
What do you
I
mean?
earned my way back in though.
What do you mean you got? Who
Who
kicked you out and was it physical?
I don't want to talk about it, but we're friends. We're friends. So I and we would kind of hear that warm intro, and I think that obviously I had another advantage, which maybe some people who were kind of in the sort of younger sneaker wearing group didn't have, which is that I had an established network in my industry, and I had I had cred, And so like and obviously being a journalist, like I am not afraid of reaching out to anyone. So I had, we had things that were like work that helped us kind of build those warm intros, but it did feel like exclusive. And I just worry that like maybe investors are not getting to see all the good companies because not everyone can get that warm intro. And I don't know, I like having been an editor who was pitched all the time. I mean, it's a very different thing pitching a story versus a business. But like you get great pitches that are cold. And because otherwise, like if you don't, like you're basically dealing with people who who can like get to you through their like New York network, but you're not getting those people who are like great writers in Kansas. And so I don't know. I just think that it's an imperfect system, and it seems like everyone's trying to work it out. But the volume I think is probably the biggest challenge. But I would hate to think that that would keep out some really great, promising companies that just don't necessarily have aren't buddies with like all the kind of cool kids downtown.
Mike, your fundraising trajectory must have been different, particularly for Button. But do you want to talk about maybe experiencing rejection or resistance even after you had this exit and then had been making investments?
Yeah, so I think the seed round for me was probably the scariest, even though I felt like I had what I needed to tell a great story, and it was hard because I don't know, it's a lot of people say it's been the go-go days for like a decade, so I don't know how hard it was, but we were in a position then where we didn't have engineers, we just had a business model and like a LinkedIn profile. It was kind of like a concept and a LinkedIn profile, like that was kind of my pitch. And it was hard, and so rejection sucks, and I think that the process of going through fundraising is probably the most humbling experience that I go through as a human, just because they, like you just feel like you are like eroded into like a little nothing, like you are not good enough, and it's like really, like my wife tells me I'm great, and then I go home and I'm like I'm great, right? And so like I feel that all the time. Entrepreneurship, that is the journey we're on, but. In the fundraising process, like they are rejecting you, it's fucking impossible. Like, sorry for my language, but it is really hard.
Impossible is a really bad word.
That is true. That's right. And so, I think from the perspective of at least like I had a pretty like scientific method of this. Like what we would end up doing is we would score our intros to prospective firms based on the connections that we had in. And so my ranking for all of you in this room, this is how I did it. The best intro to a VC or seed fund was an LP. The second best was a successful entrepreneur who had exited with that company or that investment firm. Third was a friend of the venture person you were trying to target. And then fourth was another VC introing, because there was always some risk.
It's so interesting.
And so that would be how I prioritize. And so if like the number 2 would make an offer, but I had a number 1, I'd be like, I don't need that intro, thanks dude.
That wouldn't be my ranking. That's so interesting.
Oh really?
Yeah, that wouldn't be my signal ranking.
What would your ranking be?
It would be founders above anything else.
Yeah.
So like founder that I've backed or my fund is backed, because like you know us, so it's very warm.
Yeah.
Another founder, I get a ton of interest from founders we passed on, but they've had experience with the firm.
Yeah.
So like again, they know us. And or a firm that is investing, because at seed we co-invest. So like someone who's putting their money in, or an angel that's been working or advisor with you.
Yeah.
Then I would say like, then I go down the rank into like the more generalized, we network together. So maybe you're a service provider of some sort. My LPs in general, I don't think are like I love my LPs, but most of them are directly meeting with companies, so they're not really screening companies.
I should qualify. My LPs are like rich, successful entrepreneurs,
so
than like
like
institutional people.
Got it. Yeah. So that would probably be higher.
That
Yeah.
was my
I always think
historical-
I think founders make the best. Founders know other founders, and they generally have an insight into your business. And so, especially if like the founder can write a strong intro to you? Like, oh, this is a founder I know really well, I like their idea, or I've seen them execute, like, it's like I'm probably going to take that meeting.
That made our process having one in particular angel LP founder, kind of like the perfect trifecta here. He went to bat for us with a number of firms, and that was really what led us to success.
And so one of the founders in the session this afternoon asked so they have a fourth meeting with their seed fund that they hope is the let's close on having you as the lead for our round. This meeting is tomorrow, and they were looking for last minute do's and don'ts for that. So what are the ways to nail that down or screw it up?
Fourth meeting.
I'm sorry?
Fourth meeting.
Any other details around them?
Fourth
Like, is
meeting.
it all the partnership? Is it?
No, I think it's one-on-one or two-on-one.
A couple things that comes to mind. I'd ask whether there were 4 meetings already, because that seems like a lot of meetings before a partner meeting. And so, like, I think as a founder, you really need to understand the path to actually getting funded with each fund, which is a very different process. Timing, also, decision making. Once, what are the steps before investment committee, and then how does it both work in investment committee, in order to actually figure out, like, how do you actually tailor your process with a specific fund. In that specific case, the way to trigger an investment committee meeting is to just have other ones, because VCs love to follow other VCs, frankly. And so, like, when I hear that a company that I'm like already like pretty interested in is like, by the way, I'm gonna be in San Francisco. If I hear that
On Monday.
then on Monday, then I'll be like, all right, give me your data room and we'll get through it in 2 days. If I'm already like super interested, and that really accelerates like a process in my head, because I mean, if you think about it from our perspective, right, there in the fall, I mean, there's so many companies that are fundraising that in any given week for a growth investor, I'm actually processing, like executing on probably 3 to 4 deals, and so I'm looking at prioritization, and I'm looking for signals to understand, like, am I more likely to like lose a deal depending on where you are in the cycle? So for meeting conversion, first like drive that urgency, but then really understand like what is a partnership looking for in the investment committee, because very different fund to fund. I was at 3 funds, all very different, and that'll help you in the next, hopefully get that check.
So I love the psychological profile you just shared, that you're fueled by anxiety and fear.
I'm just being honest. Every VC is.
Every VC.
Yeah, and so clearly saying I have a Sunday evening or Sunday afternoon flight to SFO is part of the shtick.
But sure, if they have yesware, that you're not opening, just be careful. I'm just saying, because everybody checks everything. So if you are saying you're in San Francisco and you're opening their emails in New York, you're going to look like a fibber. I'm serious.
I don't know any way to check that.
So it's interesting that in addition to the fear and anxiety, you have a paranoia deficit. You are underestimating your competition.
But the thing
they
is,
are checking geolocation.
The thing with geolocation is, I mean, there's such a whisper network that if a company actually tells me that they're actually doing partner meetings, then I will very quickly figure out like who it is that they're meeting with, because all VCs also talk to each other. And so I think if you're really fibbing on that, that is a big no, because it will almost always be discovered.
So
I've experienced.
you've experienced because you've been fibbing?
Oh, well.
Yeah. All right. We'll move on. So Steph, can you? I loved Amy's point about why is it the 4th meeting?
Yeah.
And understand the process. So walk us through the investment decision-making process at your fund.
Yeah, we only do early stage, so I think for a lot of the folks, this is probably relevant. Each firm is still going to be different, but there's 3 investment partners. The way that we handle our process is the first meeting is generally with one of the partners. It's either the person who you got the intro to and you've been interacting with, or we pass it along if we feel like one of our other partners is a better fit. And sometimes we'll meet a company and we'll realize after that first meeting you're going to be a better fit for another partner. But generally speaking, if we're excited about an opportunity, we talk about it at our partner meeting. We then have you meet the next partner. Usually, I'd say it's pretty unusual for us to have you to meet the other two partners together. One, just the scheduling of that is very difficult. And two, it is, I think, in our process, interesting for you to meet each partner individually. We're all very different. You're going to get very different reads on companies. And we actually don't really share that much information from the first meeting to the next meeting. So I just did a call today with the founders, and I got on the video with them today, and I said, I know you've met both Jeff and Andy. Consider me a clean slate, because I really want to hear the pitch authentically from the founder, not the way my partners pitch it to me, right? So that's very specific to our process. And then I'd say, like, the fourth meeting, we don't have a partner meeting. You don't come in and pitch the investment committee. You've now met the investment committee. So if at that point, like, the whole partnership is behind the concept of the partner sponsoring a deal, then we may start to run some diligence before that, but that's when we really dive in on talking to references and customers and things of that nature. And then usually what I like to do, and this is assuming I have time, and there's some processes where the timing gets really more condensed, is I actually like to do the reference calling before I do a follow-up meeting with the founder, because inevitably there's going to be more questions that arise. And so I'm compiling the questions my firm has to make our decision, as well as the things that I learn from the reference calls that I make. And keep in mind, like, I'm sure most of you don't have tons of data, right? So I'm kind of pulling what I can from the market intelligence that I have. And then I'll schedule kind of a follow-up. And I use that kind of what I consider generally the last meeting to be, here's all the questions we still need to understand. And sometimes some of that happens over email, or video, some of it's in person. And then we use that to kind of put together our internal process to make a decision. So a fourth meeting for us actually probably is very far along in your process. What I would say, and this is coming from my founders, I had a couple of my founders on stage 2 weeks ago for our annual meeting and or our founder summit, and we were talking about their fundraising. And one thing that really struck me is one of our founders was talking about when when an investor has a hump that you're just clearly not going to get over, they keep asking the same question over and over and over again. Guess what? You're probably not going to change their mind. It doesn't matter how great your answer is. If they keep getting stuck on the same thing, most likely they're just not going to get around it. And you could have the best response and answer for that, but there's clearly that's the roadblock, and getting around that roadblock just isn't going to happen. So I think as you go further into meetings, especially with the person that's going to lead your deal, really pay attention to are they getting stuck on the same thing? And if I'm not getting them unstuck, I probably think this isn't going to work.
Can you just ask them directly? What
do you mean?
In this scenario, since it's
what are you stuck on?
No, well, where are you in your process? What?
Oh,
this
yeah.
is our fourth meeting.
Oh, yeah.
Can
We
you
always
be direct?
we tell them the entire time where they are in the process. We're up front in the beginning.
No,
when
but in this situation where it hasn't been transparent, and they're wondering
Oh, I don't know where they are in their process. I don't know who they're talking, what firm they're talking to.
No, I know, but I'm just saying, as for anybody, any founder,
right.
If I was on my fourth meeting, do
yeah.
you feel like you would recommend just being very direct? And
asking?
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. You should be asking when you have the first meeting with the partnership, even if it's you have 2 minutes at the end of the meeting, the question you should ask is, what's the next step in your process, and what is your process like? I think that should be the number one question you ask an investor. Not do you like this? Do you like this? Do you like this company? Putting me on this, I will tell you some impression of the company, putting me on the spot. Sometimes I want to digest things and think, but the first thing you should be asking me is, what's your process like? And that is my responsibility to tell you about my process. We keep our process on our website. You can go to our website and find out exactly what our process looks like.
And Amanda, when you're asking Steph the question about, and I really like the image of someone is stuck and you're not going to get them unstuck, have you been in situations where you've met with investors and you've gotten the sense they are stuck, or in retrospect you've realized they were stuck, they were never going to get there? I wish I had realized that first. How do you get someone unstuck or get yourself out of a process where they're just insurmountably stuck?
Well, I feel in the early stage, it's more opaque. I felt the sort of rounds after the seed round, we would ask about process right away. It just felt like there was more clarity around each aspect, and so, yeah. I think there. What was interesting, there was what ended up being our lead investor when we were in our seed round. He from the very beginning was we're in. And I was great, what does that mean? you know, does he gonna write a check? Like what, you know, like there's so much mystery, you know, and what that meant actually was that because they were a seed, and this is again like a while ago, you guys probably have more structure, like seed stage investors have more structure now, but his way of like basically doing diligence was to let us go off and like pitch a bunch of other people and see who liked us, like, and see who like see how we fared, like were his instincts being you know, validated by other people. And that was extremely painful and tedious, but I mean I get it now. And it was a technique that, you know, kind of worked for this investor, but it left us kind of like in this limbo because we couldn't really like be saying this person was, we didn't know if we could say this person was in. And so I don't know if I'm answering your question, but I just remember there was a lot of uncertainty in that first round, and it was really just tough because you're dealing with like angels and seed investors. There's just a lot of informalities that don't exist in the like later rounds. The later rounds, I feel like it's very like they don't also like people don't, they won't have a second meeting with you if they're if you're not a fit. It seems to me. But whereas the seed stage, because there's so much uncertainty about your company as well, that an investor might want to meet with you a couple of times to really kind of like feel out the idea and get to know you better, see if they can really trust you with this, if you're really the person who's going to build this.
So I think that a lot of people at seed stage or seed plus or seed plus and a half or seed plus and a half prime, whatever the million gradations we now have are in this position of I'm in, and now the founder doesn't know if that means they can go tell people this person's in, because the first thing another seed investor is going to do is they're going to call and say, what does it mean that you're in, and you know, how much do you like this? And it gives them a zero cost, risk-free option, and then they get to see things like how long does it take them to round up the rest of the money, and how does it feel in terms of the cadence and substance of the communications back from that founder over time? What's it going to feel like when I'm actually an investor? And so I guess I'm kind of wondering, when that happens, Steph, when someone comes to you, or Amy, when someone comes to you and says, I've got these folks who are going to be participating in my round, what do you do with that info, and how do you receive that info?
So typically, there's either I have someone who's going to be leading my round, I have a term sheet, or I've got some folks that are interested in joining the syndicate, right? So you probably, I think that's the example you're more talking about, which is there's probably been some angels or some smaller funds that have said they'll put in 100K, 200K, 300K. And it may be predicated on you finding a lead, or maybe more ambiguous, which is very true. When we sit down with a company, we're always going to ask them how much they're targeting to raise, and if they have any kind of commitments yet, because what we're trying to do is we're trying to gauge, not are there other people interested. In fact, I don't really pay that much attention to that. What I'm more curious about is how much is available in the round, because we have ownership requirements. And I also want to get a sense for, I actually sat down, well, that's a different story, but so I would say I'm not, as a lead of a round and as an institutional seed fund, it's interesting and nice to see that you've gotten some folks that have raised their hand to participate. They may or may not be the folks that we think would be the right fit if we were going to participate in the round, and I think we do sit down and we look at who's, when I'm committing to a company, and let's say I'm writing a check of $1 million-ish and it's a $2 million round, I'll say, who else do you have interest from? And we'll put the list together and we'll take a look at it and we'll say, well, there are people that we should think about bringing in because of certain expertise or relationships or other dimensions we want to add to the cap table that maybe aren't represented here. So we'll maybe make some intros that their networks maybe didn't surface. And we'll take a look and see what makes sense, because a lot of times I think early stage founders are often taking the first money they can get as commitments, and maybe those checks you may want to still take them, but you may flex the amount down and look to people with more the rich uncle scenario, right? Versus Do I get someone who's maybe works with a lot of companies in my particular space and has intros that can help me? So I think that more professional seed investors will find an interesting signal coming from those folks coming in, but at the end of the day, it's a very different signal versus someone saying, "I'm leading the round, I'm pricing the round, I'm committing to be the person that shepherds putting a round together."
So you just said, "I'm leading the round, I'm pricing the round," and those are two different things, particularly at seed. 15 years ago, they weren't two different things. 15 years ago, they were the same thing.
Right.
And now we see a lot of early rounds that are, I'm refusing to price the round. You and I won't know how much of the company I own. Because
Is it on cap note?
Because well, no, even a cap note, I still won't know exactly how much, right? So
You can back into that.
Can you talk a little bit about how you think about different structures?
Yeah, so we unless it's a Y Combinator company, which always raises on those companies always raise on a safe, so that's just not worth talking about. We like to do priced rounds. Typically, the companies we work with are raising around $3 million. I think it gets a little sticky to have $3 million in debt that rolls into the next round. So for that reason, I think it's cleaner to do the pricing. It costs a little bit more. Your lawyers appreciate that, but it also sets up a lot of the structural things that a company will need to do at Series A. So in many cases, we can kind of set up a really clean structure for the company that sets a precedent when you go to negotiate and go to close your Series A. So I think for a lot of reasons, it's nice to do the price. I think when you get into firms or individuals maybe that are less professional investors or less institutional, I think is a better way to put it, investors or angels, you may find notes are the way that those folks tend to work. If you're only raising $500,000 and you're going to do that over a rolling period and you want to close 100K here and you're close 50K next month, then a note is the most appropriate way to do that. If you're going to do a proper raise of a few $1 million and try to get all of that money in at the same time, I would argue the structure of doing a priced round makes a lot of sense. So it really does depend on how much you're raising, who's kind of catalyzing the round coming together. And oftentimes we will find companies raising on notes and we will say, well, we're interested in committing, but we'd like to price the round. We'd like to do it as priced round. And usually the pricing is predicated somewhere off the cap of your note if you already had a cap on your note, but maybe not, because maybe the cap of your note was unrealistic.
Anyone have a different view or view they want to share on structure and instruments?
So just to follow up on that, I would say that, again, know the investor you're talking to. There are some funds that actually almost exclusively lead rounds. So I would say, like Lightspeed, at every stage, we lead unless we have to co-lead. And then, and because most institutional funds, they're looking really at ownership thresholds. And so, and I think there's a lot more flexibility at this stage, but the more institutional a fund you're at, the more we're trying to punch into 20% ownership is like kind of the standard. And that's based off of okay, a fund needs to return 3 to 5x net, over a 10-year period. And so what kind of ownership of company do you really need so that risk adjusted at the exit, you are actually getting those kinds of returns, and that's how VCs actually back into 20%. Although realistically, we've been in a bull market, and so a lot of times we can only get like 10 to 20%, and for exceptional companies, it's very much fine. And so just understanding, because if you already have a lead investor, then I would say, as a founder, your time is very precious, and so it's not worth probably talking to a bunch of other funds in which they will never actually, invest passively or follow on to another lead.
And when you say for exceptional companies, you'll make an exception, that means that if you turn me down, for instance, because I can only give you 15 or 16% of my company, your view is you like me enough to do the investment, but I'm not exceptional. Oh, it's a serious question.
I mean, for an acceptable company, we'll take a lot of range of ownership.
It's an interesting test. Okay.
I just will echo.
Yeah.
Learning the ownership percentages sounds very foreign to an entrepreneur, especially seed and A. And I will tell you that I have maximized the value of our investment and value of the company multiple times through that knowledge. Yeah. And that knowledge is not given oftentimes, I mean, like Amy sounds like the nicest investor in the universe, so I want to work with you at some point. But most are not that nice. You sound lovely too. I'll
tell you up front what my ownership percentages are.
But I think that the point I'm making is that knowing that gives you an unfair advantage over maybe the investor, but more importantly, over the folks you're competing with for those dollars. And I think that's really helpful.
And how did you acquire that info?
You know what? It's been funny. It's been through talking to people like him. He is like a seer. No, but there's a lot of information you can get from founders who've gone through this before with the specific firms you're talking to. And I just advise all of you to take the opportunity when you're thinking about taking money to do reference checks on the investors. And you can gain a lot of information from that. It also puts the investor, I don't know, it's not all a game, it feels like dating. I haven't dated for like 20 years, so I'm pretty boring, but I watch rom-coms. So, but you do not always want to be calling and asking for updates and saying like, what do you think of me? That doesn't work in dating, it's not going to work in venture. And so think about it from the perspective of like, if you ask them for references, they know that you've got options in all likelihood, or at least you're doing your homework and you're being diligent. And in those reference conversations, you can learn a ton. So take advantage of that.
About the mechanics of the deal and what the parameters that they're seeking are.
Yeah, that, I mean, is one of the things that you can learn relative to this question. Yeah, there's a ton more you can learn too that's really important. But
Amanda, any thoughts on structure or percentage ownership or how you navigated those kinds of things, or you just were trying to knock down the bowling pins as much as you could so that you got enough investors on board?
Probably the latter, but I feel like when we started our company, the sort of like 1.0 version was very content focused because we intentionally wanted to do that, and it happened to be at a time where we're back at this phase again, but where media was like nobody cared about media, and in fact that first investor was saying like, well, we got to find people who aren't allergic to media, and that was very few people. So like we kind of started feeling like we had a very small pool of people to talk to in the first place, and I feel like at various points of like we raised four times I guess, yeah, and I should know that more fluidly, but anyway. I think we always felt we were always in a kind of a position of like not being in a like sort of hot area, and so we never expected like amazing like valuations or but like we sort of understood the basic like what you didn't want, but over time I realized that actually like we ended up with like pretty standard, like pretty good. We ended up maintaining a pretty good amount of ownership, which it's a little bit of a crapshoot. I think we tended to like follow our hearts and like with people like our instincts of like who we wanted to work with, what people who we thought were like good people who would really be additive and who we would want to work with, and I would not change a thing on that front. We weren't always right, but I think the instinct was right.
Without calling anyone out, what did you learn about what's the takeaway for the founders in the current program? And I neglected to mention that you yourself are an alum of the program since Food 52 went through. What's the takeaway for these founders on where it was that you were wrong, where you thought like, this is an investor I really want to work with, and yet in retrospect today, X number of years later, you're like, yeah, I got that wrong. Why?
Yeah, so it's not just about it's not just about like what like that fund's expertise is. It really is. It comes down to like, do you trust this person? Is this person going to be good to you and really function as a partner in good times and bad? I mean, it is. It's the dating thing, right? And so I think founders tend not to focus, especially at the earliest stages, tend not to focus because you're so desperate for money that you're just like, and you also like are looking to get money from the people who are like kind of the bold-faced names of investors, and I get that, but I like ultimately you have to work with these people, and do you share the same values?
There's a saying among VCs that the top 25% of your portfolio companies is how you get all your returns, and then the bottom, or the rest of the companies are how you actually make your reputation over a long period of time. And so going back to your references, I think the number one question you really should ask, if you have the luxury of a few options, right, as investors, is how did an investor behave when things weren't going well, right? And so it could be you missed a quarter target, or it could be way more dire, existential things that are happening with your company. But really, like, especially if a VC has been in the industry for a long time, like you will hear so many stories in the positive and negative, and a lot of VCs know that about each other, which is why a lot of VCs kind of group together and they really like to invest with each other because they know sort of like how someone's going to react, and you don't want somebody who's reactive, right, with short-term news. You want somebody who's really going to be a partner with you for 10 plus years.
That is such good advice. It is so important to ask, and every time we go through the reference process, we ask for an entrepreneur that you've succeeded with, an entrepreneur that you failed with, so that we know both sides of the story. And of course, they provide one that they were super nice to, and then you call a couple that they've failed with that they did not provide, and really understand how that treatment was through thick and thin.
So I'm gonna actually bug Habib, who I see in the audience, because you said people who've been around in this industry for a long time, and Habib Karuz has been investing in venture and PE for like 25 years, and I know that I was in a particularly bad situation with you, and was just amazed at how, at the level of focus and integrity in that situation, you really do make your reputation on those kinds of, on how you behave in those kinds of situations. And you've invested in a lot of companies, you've raised a lot of funds, you've also invested in a lot of venture funds. And I don't know if you have particular learning about what things you can see early on without doing the reference checks. Like what are the codes that you can help founders use to understand which investors might not be there for the long haul, or might be particularly prickly to deal with 3 years later when things are not going well?
I think reputation precedes you in this industry. It's remarkable how easy it is to reference a VC. It's actually much easier to reference a VC than it is to reference a VC. At the end of the day, probably the best reference is to talk to management teams who work with the VC where things did not work out, especially in situations where boards have had to make management changes and how they behave, how they handle those situations. But that when things are going well, everybody's happy. No one's complaining on how it's done. It's really when times are tough. That's how the reputation goes.
Yeah, and that's a spin on the give me a reference where it didn't work out. It's give me a reference where you were on the board when the management team had to be swapped out. That's not one that I typically hear, and I wonder, would you react negatively if someone asked you for that kind of reference? And thank you, Habib.
No, not at all. I think that you enter into a marriage, not that I've been married, but hypothetically, because you're bringing on a board member who's going to possibly be with you for several years. You need to know everything, and any VC that's offensive around those questions, I think is a red flag for you.
So you mentioned, Amy, that we've been in a bull market for a long time, and a number of the founders raised questions about WeWork and the ramifications of WeWork, and that every VC seems to have a viewpoint that they've blogged about or tweeted about, and that dovetails into a conversation about the coming recession, which may or may not be happening. So do you see valuations changing? Do you see deal dynamics changing? Does Lightspeed have a market bias on what WeWork means, or is it is WeWork just one example of many, a particularly gory example, but one example of many where we are starting to see a little bit of a shift?
Yeah, so I do, and it really starts with the public markets, right? And so, as growth investors, we actually do a lot of education, knowledge transfer with our early stage partners at Lightspeed, because we constantly keep an eye on what's going on in the markets and how public equity analysts and also investors are looking at risks and what they are really valuing, because that is just an indicator for when our growth portfolios are going to exit in the next few years, like what kind of market they're going to be entering into. And then for an earlier stage company that's actually going to raise another couple of rounds, what should they be thinking about, like as you're talking to growth investors, right? So it's kind of like a trickle down. And so in the past, I would say in the past couple months, for enterprise, like the valuation multiples are starting to come down from stratospheric, I would say, multiples. And we got Zoom at I think 44 times, forward revenue multiple, which is crazy. And then in the consumer world, whether it's marketplace or direct to consumer, or certainly consumer tech companies with heavy operations, so asset heavy operations. I mean, we may be in kind of like a 10-year low right now on some of these multiples, and so that really informs where we are both, where we're looking at in terms of like when we're leading around, what is the range of acceptable valuations that we're going to be giving to a company, or if it's in a competitive round, do we want to step out if it's just at a valuation where we can no longer see a path, like a 3 to 5x return on money for that company. And then I think like the earlier stage it is, the farther away I think that valuation sensitivity is. And so for our early stage teams, so at our partnership meeting, we actually are looking at both early and growth stage deals together. And I would say you still see these very, very hot value deals come together in the early stage, and I'm not really seeing a lot of valuation sensitivity there. But in growth stage, both in consumer and enterprise, I definitely am. There's a lot more focus on particularly like capital intensive tech businesses, which WeWork is one of them, and there's a number of others. We have some in our portfolio as well. I think seeing what happened with the public markets with WeWork and some of the other businesses made us very, very aware that there's not going to always be a SoftBank to save this company and provide another $1 billion of funding. And so then or 16 billion. And so from when we were thinking about our responsibilities as board members, we're really just actually being a lot more vocal with our founders that you actually there's going to be a very different environment coming up, and you need to think about how you get your business to unit economics that make a lot more sense. And I mean, most of the founders in our portfolio have never seen a downturn, and so this is a very foreign feeling. I actually entered the venture community in the last recession, and so I actually saw 4 to 5x forward multiples in enterprise businesses, and thought that was the norm, and then now coming back realize it's very much not. And so I think those are things to think about, and it's good to talk to investors to see how they think about your business, particularly if it's a consumer operations heavy business, because they're very much impacted by stories like WeWork, and potentially impact your own.
So one thing I want to push back on, and then I want to hear from staff. You said tech companies like WeWork. In what possible way
Good question.
is a subleasing business a tech company?
That's a good question. I mean, tech. So there's a whole thread where it's tech-enabled, really services businesses, or in the WeWork sense, I think not a tech business or a tech-enabled services business, but it's attracted traditionally tech investors into their rounds, are under a lot of scrutiny, and I think having a lot of trouble raising large sums of money. So
doesn't that also just sort of speak to the issue of, if you're a tech investor making an investment in a company that isn't a tech company, that's in an entirely different sector, you might not have the greatest degree of insight?
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to this feeling of paranoia and FOMO, fear of missing out. I think in the bull market, there's just so much capital right now, right, in growth and in early stage, that we're struggling, to find really high quality assets for money in, when we see growth the way that we were growing, I think most investors are like, you know what, there's going to be another SoftBank round down the road, and so they actually start taking like lottery, they start taking high amounts of risk that somebody will fund this business, and clearly public investors are more willing to do that in this case. So I think it's really driven by investors chasing returns for their fund and having to look at alternative, non-traditional tech companies, non-tech companies in order to find some of that.
Steph?
So I'll talk specifically at Seed because I think this is for the vast majority of the audience in the room. The reality at Seed is that there's probably more seed capital today than there ever has been from more sources. So what that means for you as someone raising seed capital is you may not raise from your top choice, but you will probably find a pool of capital somewhere. And so what we're seeing in the market is a couple factors that I think you as a founder, I think, are smart to realize that the market may not look and feel the way it does today in the next 5 to 10 years as you're raising follow-ons for your company. And so one thing we're seeing is we're seeing so much money coming into like this pre-seed, but yet pre-seed doesn't get you. You may raise $1 million or $1.5 million, but you don't have the traction you need for a Series A investment yet to raise $10 million. And so now you're finding yourself raising another $2 million or $3 million. So suddenly now you've raised somewhere in the ballpark of $3.5 to $4 million, maybe $5 million before you raise a Series A. And you're going to obviously take dilution of both rounds. If you jack up the price of that very first round artificially, it's going to limit who might actually take a look at that second seed round. It may actually prohibit an investor from coming in and giving you a term sheet. It also may, I've actually passed on companies in the last year or two where I've looked at the cap table of the founders and the initial pre-seed investors and realized that if I did a round at a reasonable price, probably a price higher than I would want to pay for the company, but still a reasonable price to pay at seed, the founders wouldn't own enough of the company. And therefore, I have to make a decision, do I fund the company now and know that I'm going to get diluted in the future because the founders have to get bumped up or risk losing the founders in the future? Or do I pass, right? And so I think you have to be conscious of not diluting too much at each round, but you also have to be conscious of not jacking up your prices so much that you preclude the next round of funding from coming in, whether that's pre-seed to seed or seed to A, right? And so what we're finding is that the bar, because there is, again, so much capital out there, there's so many people raising seed, the bar for Series A is growing higher and higher and higher. Because yes, it's more expensive to run companies in any market, the Valley, New York, et cetera. The cost of that is going up. But also, as companies raise more money, they can use that money to potentially get to a further milestone or to grow a little bit longer before they hit the market. And therefore, if you've raised a year's worth of capital and someone else, your competitors raised 2 years worth of capital and you hit the market at the same time, they've got 2 years of traction, you have one, like that's going to make it difficult to raise. So I think the reality is for seed, it's easy to raise seed money. It's easy to find seed money. It may not be the money you want, but you will find it. But you have to think about the fact that will most likely not be the last capital you raise. So if you and the investors you work with, frankly, are irresponsible about how they price those deals, it will probably bite you down the road.
So I want to layer in a difference between notes and price rounds in what you've said, and also tie it back to what Amy said about most of the founders in your portfolio have not lived through a down round. Yeah. So I started at Lowenstein. I was a summer associate here in '91, which was a recession for those who weren't born in '91. And so I've been through this cycle working with tech companies and venture-backed companies and IPOs that were pulled for a long time, and have seen lots of, like, there are periods where we didn't really have a whole lot of people who had worked on up rounds, right? And so now it is very different, and I worry about the lack of preparedness for that kind of situation. Convertible notes with a cap also have a 20% discount to the price of the next round. Sometimes it's 15, sometimes it's 25, sometimes the scale slides, but they have a discount to the price of the next round. In the unbelievably unlikely event that your next round is actually below the cap, your investors still get a 20% discount to that low price of whatever is below the cap, and the interest also converts, and it converts at that discount. there is no priced round where that is going to happen. There's some mathematical anti-dilution adjustment in a priced round, but it is not going to be near that level. And for people who have safes or convertible notes, we typically see that they will tranche them, and they'll have a note at this cap and a safe at that cap and another thing at this other cap. And that creates iterative math as you figure out what those conversion prices look like and which I mean, it's order of operations, right? Which math problem do I have to solve first? And when things are all below the cap, it can be very
It's a problem
ugly.
even when they're not below the cap, when you have a bunch of
Yes,
notes at
it
different
is.
tranches, right? I mean, like, because it just doesn't give you clarity. If you've raised, you could easily raise $2 million on a bunch of notes at different prices, and you think you're diluting by, you think you're adding $2 million to the round, but you're really not adding $2 million to the round.
So 20 minutes ago when you disagreed with me about not really knowing your percentage ownership in a note situation.
No, I thought you meant investors. I know what my percentage ownership in it. I roughly can calculate that.
But the
because I thought we were
founders
talking
don't
about founders. Founders don't if they have multiple notes.
Yeah.
If multiple notes on different prices. If it's one note at one price, it's like.
Do you have a blog post on this? Like a real detailed blog post?
So other than the case study I published at Columbia, the companion article in the Wall Street Journal, and a couple of things in Forbes, no.
So it's called a alley-oop. I think that's helpful because this is real complex. But the thing that I have found that has helped founders a ton is just reading through examples that I know you've written. So try to find his piece. I'm sure he'll send them to you. But
But there are ways to get around it. But I think one of the things that I wish people focused on in making those kinds of decisions is not just what's the pain factor today, because we all understand that closing a safe is much faster and simpler than closing a price round. But how does it play out? How does it create alignment or misalignment 6 months or 18 months from now? And what impact, if any, will it have on the relationship because there's some lack of clarity or because people didn't get kind of what they thought they were
Can I
gonna
add a
get?
comment though on
Yeah.
that though? I mean, I think there's a difference between safes rolling into an A versus seed.
Mm-hmm.
What I would say as a seed investor, and I think this would probably be true of most of my seed peers, is if you come having done a bunch of safes at a certain cap, I might offer you a price at a price that's lower than that cap. But again, that to me is probably just, hey, we're just not aligned, right? You're expecting a valuation for this that is too high. I'm going to come in at a valuation that's going to be too low relative to the expectations of you and the other investors who I might know very well. So you know what? This just isn't going to be a fit. So I think even though the mechanics of the safe or the note will allow someone to come in and do a price round at a lower price and allow the protection to flow through to the previous investors, my argument, especially at early stage, would be it's just, again, think about the volume of deals that investors have. It just might be too painful to get to a deal that works really nicely if your notes are too high.
Yeah. So now that we're talking about iterative math and the mechanics of calculations, we should probably take some questions from those of you who've just sat through the discussion on iterative math. So if you have questions, just raise your hand. I certainly have some more from the founders, but if anyone does, we'll do a couple.
I guess, Stephanie, just as a point of clarification to your last point, can you help us understand more of how you would go about pricing a seed round? The
Yeah.
different ways you can, and what makes something
Great.
too high?
It's really like it's seed. It's just like we're not doing some like multiple on revenue or anything like that, right? So it's a combination of how early is the company, how much capital does the company want and need to raise, and roughly understand it. I think that the range in which founders typically dilute at a typical, call it couple $1 million seed round, is going to be give or take 20 to 25%. It could be a little lower than that. It could be a little higher than that. So like, really to me, it becomes a very simple math problem. And where we negotiate is probably on the edges, not on what I think drives valuation. If you're thinking about what can drive your valuation up, which I don't always think is the right thing to do, But if you're thinking about what drives valuation up, it's momentum. It's the fact that there could be other term sheets out there, or that you have choice, right? You having choice can certainly allow. So what we've found in the market is that oftentimes there's so much capital out there that an inexperienced fund may come in and give you a price that's higher than we would want to pay. You're going to take our money, but we're going to have to pay more for it. Do I think that's right? Not necessarily. But sometimes that happens, and sometimes we'll walk away from the deal if we feel the price is too egregious. But yeah, I think there's roughly, I think if you kind of keep in mind, I'm going to dilute plus minus 5% around 20%. Like that's probably what you're going to give up for the first couple of rounds. And if you're raising $4 million, it's different than raising $2 million. So it's not an exact science. Momentum, traction. Is the company in revenue? Has it been bootstrapped to $500,000 in revenue? That's going to look very different than a company that hasn't launched a product yet. So all of those things, like we're factoring in like how much, and then I think about too. The goal when we invest is that the company won't need more money before they get to Series A. But certainly I think if we feel like it could be a company that may need a little bit more capital because it could take longer, we're going to factor that in too, because if we can't make the price too high that we can't put more capital in later. So we need to give companies the room to grow into the next level of valuation.
I have another perspective on that actually. So sometimes there's a dynamic between seed-focused funds versus life cycle funds that sometimes do seed investments, and you'll see very different.
Yes.
Yes. I'm sure Stephanie actually hates this difference, but
yeah.
For example, at Lightspeed, we have such a large fund, and sometimes we just want optionality to actually lead a company Series A, and so we'll actually take 5% or something of a seed, and we're almost entirely valuation insensitive, like for a round like that, because for us, the difference between if we want to back this founder, we think it's going to be a multi-billion-dollar business, whether even if it's priced, whether the pre is at 40 or even 100 sometimes, it actually doesn't matter for us. And so, and by the way, this is also a very West Coast mentality, valuation sensitivity, relatively. And so it's interesting because if you have a blend of seed-focused investors, but then also interest from a life cycle fund, you'll see that dynamic play out where they're much less.
I walk away. Honestly, like if I have a life cycle fund that's jacking up the price outrageously, I'm going to walk away because that's what it is. It's optionality, and I'm going to sit there, take the board seat, work with you for the next 2 years to make sure the company hits the milestones it needs to raise an A, and make sure that you can talk to, if provided you hit those milestones, you're talking to a host of people that will invest. And the flip side to taking, I think for a lot of founders, the flip side to taking the optionality check is if they pass, it sends a massive signal because they're insiders, they have info in the company, right? So that's where it plays out in the wrong way. In a best case scenario, everybody loves each other, the company works, they pile more money in, and they got that chance to buy up early.
Amanda, did you see that disconnect in fundraising between seed funds and different kinds of investors? You've got some multi-stage investors in the company, or it never really became a problem for you?
I don't think it was a problem for us. It wasn't. Yeah. Sorry, I don't have an
No, that's
answer
good.
for that.
I think it often is
It's kind of cyclical,
invisible
though.
to founders, and yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of cyclical as to when funds kind of dive in and do it and then pull back.
Yeah. Rachel, and then. Go ahead.
I have a question. These channels are always filled with great investors who are dealing with competitive deals. And repeatedly, I've seen entrepreneurs who are I might have one person seriously in diligence. I'd love to hear from the folks on the panel on when you get a sense that there is no competition or there is no momentum, but you like this entrepreneur. How did the entrepreneur get you to close when you had a sense that you're probably the last one standing?
You asking the entrepreneurs or the investors?
Well, the investors.
Okay.
I think oftentimes we're the first ones to meet a company, so there isn't necessarily the signal that there's other investors in the mix. And then there are definitely times where we've met companies that, they could have been companies that tested the waters with a lot of people and it didn't work out or not. I mean, we really do strive to make our investment decisions independent of what the market is doing. We have to be conscientious of can we get the round filled because we don't take the full round. So we have to believe that if we commit, we're going to be able to put a strong syndicate together to help the founder. But you know, I don't, we have plenty of really weird things in our fund. You know, I invested in a company a year and a half, 2 years ago that puts wings on the back of the tractor on a truck to cover the gap, that, you know, that reduces the flow of air, right? So, I mean, that's a weird company, right? Like, that's a weird, you know, it does more than that, and there's a very interesting wedge strategy there that I think will play out really nicely over the next couple of years, but that's a weird company, and that founder's not going to find a ton of people that are going to get excited about that wedge of the trucking industry. So, you know, we have trying to like. You know, the founder had a super compelling story. He had a really unique insight. He had this particular idea has been like the concept of what he was working on had plagued him for 10 years, and he had patented the rough idea years ago. Was kind of working on it on the side until he figured out how he was going to bring something to market, and like. There was, like, I knew the grit of that founder really came through for me. And he had some referenceable, like, early pilots going on, so I could talk to customers. And I could look at some macro trends that suggested that he was, I felt, timed right in the space. So I do think, you know, there are some funds that totally invest on trends that everyone is out there. But seed investors, we actually make our money off of the really weird deals. If you look at, you know, when my partner Jeff invested in Fitbit in 2008, like, no one was wearing hardware on their wrist that would measure the steps that you were taking, and that wasn't even a thing. And that was not an easy company to raise money for over many rounds. And yet, it's been interesting to see how it's performed in the public markets. But, you know, it admittedly is a very successful investment for us and for all of the investors that backed that company over the years. And so I do think early stage investors, if you're a founder that has a company in kind of a weird space, especially, like, you need to look for investors that back weird things. 25% of our 10 to 20, I think it's 15 to 20% of our portfolio is carved out for what we call new areas, and that's stuff we've never invested in. And in 2011, that was EdTech when I did Class Dojo. So I mean, I think that. I think while, yes, there's going to be obvious founders that come out of platform companies or people that have been founders and back before, but I do think, you know, there are, like, VCs do make, especially seed stage investors, we make our money off of the outliers. And so I do think a lot of us have strategies around investing in outliers, and oftentimes it is believing in something that no one else sees. So I don't think that just because everybody says no, or because you don't have a 5 other term sheets chasing you, that to me is not necessarily a signal.
There was another question here, and then there's one here, and then I think we'll wrap. Go ahead.
For the investors, how much communication do you expect from the companies invested in?
After the round or before the round?
After you made the investment, if they're one of your companies, how much communication do you expect?
Oh, so again, I think some funds are less involved, I think, with the companies, and some are more. I mean, I think every single investor at Lightspeed is very involved with their company, so we actually do expect a lot of communication, bi-directional. But I actually think just more communication is always better, because again, like, every company goes through peaks and valleys, and so during those, like, low points in your business, if you've actually built a long-standing, like, you know, degree of trust with your investor, that you've been really open to sharing a lot of information, they're going to be a lot more willing to bend over backwards and helping you through, like, you know, the low points. And that's built over a lot of communication over a long period of time. Even when, and you know, the companies that, you know, when things are going well, they're just like, I don't want to talk to any of you investors. You mean nothing to me other than money, right? And we see a lot of that. And then when, you know, the time gets tough, and all of a sudden they're asking us to do really unnatural things, it's like, well, this is the first time, you know, you've reached out in 2 years, and so I don't know what to make of the request. So yeah, I would say more is good.
Mike, do you want to chime in on your cadence of communication with investors?
Yeah, I think the best relationships I have check and call once every 2 to 4 weeks with all of the board members. Yeah. And that's, you know, they're your boss, but they are your partner too. So they're as invested in your success as you are almost. And so the importance, I think, there is you just be forthright, and then if you are communicating all the time, it really helps you as the entrepreneur. I see so many entrepreneurs fail to use their investors. Use them. Like really use them. Like make them uncomfortable how much you use them. And when you've used them too much, then you'll know, because they'll either get annoyed or they'll stop responding to your requests. But the reason I say that is because they are really vested in you succeeding, and they have way more connections typically. They have way more ways to open doors. They have entrepreneurs that have been successful, and the most success that we've had using investors or relying on them has been the angels that have gone through the cycle before, or the LPs and funds that came in that were successful entrepreneurs that could open doors for us for relationships. But I would say the more strategic you are, the more focused you are, and the more specific your asks are for these investors, the more you'll get out of them. And I think keeping that communication open all the time is really important.
Amanda?
I just wanted to add something because this is like a mistake that I made, which is that would be in regular touch with investors, but like sort of would save things for the board meeting because I thought like, okay, this is the time when we're all in a room, and so it wasn't. I was sort of, it would be good news, it'd be bad news. And a number of things like did not land well. And I was like, but this is like our time together. Why? And I had to learn over time that like with certain topics, like to like socialize them first among board members. And I learned this from Lowenstein, actually. This is advice that we got from Rob, and it was really helpful. And I mean, this is why like I did not do well at a big corporation, because that's sort of what you have to do all the time. And that was, it like transformed things because people did not feel like blindsided. And, I was not trying to blindside them. I just thought like, oh, this is our time to talk. You guys are busy, we're busy. But in fact, like, they kind of, with certain topics, you need to kind of like ease people into it because they're not in it every day with you. And I think I wasn't like thinking that through.
Great, that's great. So there was a question here, go ahead. This will be our last one.
I had a question from two perspectives, one from an entrepreneur perspective and one from an investor perspective, which was, we hear this expression all the time, I have to clean up the cap table. And so one is like when you're raising money as an entrepreneur, like obviously if you're raising 100 people, it's different, but what's sort of the right amount of people to raise from? And then as an investor, I'm an angel investor in some deals. We just did one actually with Lightspeed recently. A lot of times the venture guys want to push us out, and we want to ride the company through. So just wanted to hear about this cap table thing.
Do you want to? No. All right.
I can. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
I can start with that from a. There's two definitions of cleaning up the cap table. One is actually just seeing the party around, and the other is actually cleaning up the cap table, recapping a company. So maybe the first one. A lot of it is an ownership question, right? Funds do it because they're just trying to get to that maybe like 10% ownership, and they can't get there if there's another few funds that are trying to get in. And so there's this kind of jostle of how much does the insiders want to do, right? And sometimes there's a whole conversation that has to happen where the insiders get pulled back a little bit in order to let in another lead investor because the company is thinking, well, you know what, that lead investor can actually take me the next 3 rounds, forward. And so it's very important to actually bring them on. If I have to pull back a couple of other folks, they tend to be very unhappy. Like if they, and that's actually sometimes like a long-term relationship sacrifice that gets made by an investor if they actually do cram down other investors in order to get in. And I don't think it's a good strategy. It's always good to play nice with the other investors. And so, like I think in terms of like why do funds get really sensitive around not too many other funds at the table is because of ownership.
So they shut you out of the deal and you were an angel.
Got it. Well, first of all, apologies. Yeah, I mean,
you called out the fund. That's worse than calling out the company.
I honestly really don't know of another reason other than to get to an ownership threshold. Because if the angel check is a couple $100,000, we'll bring them on. In fact, we want them to have like strategic angels in a round, right? Because they have really specific strategic value. But I think when the angel round is like a few million, and it significantly punches into like what, for example, our fund would be able to get in ownership, we think about it this way. You know, we can get 5% in a company, or 10% or 20%, and the work we'll actually do is the same. And so it's very important to get those ownership thresholds, because we want to have that, you know, we want to have that consistent, you know, service provider experience, kind of, you know, relationship with these founders. And we'll do it if we only have 3% of the company. But it's, you know, that's definitely something to consider.
So, and I'm not saying this just to be a good host, and I do appreciate you being here, but there are a number of funds that are targeting percentage. I spend time, and my colleague Matthew Moisen and I spent time with one of the founders that we represent as counsel yesterday on this issue, where we have investors who've been in the company for a while. The relationships have become imperfect. The structures that were employed early on were employed without really thinking about what happens 2 years, 3 years, 5 years later. And it's very desirable to clean things up in a way that facilitates forward motion. And so that's a situation where we're not talking about a fund that needs to clean up for ownership. We're talking about a company that needs a different structure, and where they're making a bunch of changes because there are some things that aren't particularly working for everyone that we think collectively will be impediments. And we do see a combination of the two. And if I'm a founder and you've believed in me and written a check, I could certainly understand how that founder might say to you, it's the fund pushing for ownership, rather than you and some of your fellow angels have been a pain in the ass to deal with, and we want you out of our company, because it's an easier conversation to blame Lightspeed. And I'm not saying Lightspeed wasn't to blame in this situation. I'm just saying that there are there's a range of why that happens, and sometimes it's because there's been a negative experience, or a negative experience in another deal with that, you know, with that set of angels or someone in that angel group. So it, you know, kind of runs the gamut. So I know that we're timed out now, so we'll end on that lovely, uncomfortable question, but it is a good question, and it does happen in the market, and that's why you need judgment and people who've, you know, been around in up markets and down markets, and it's good. It's not straightforward. So a couple of quick announcements. January 15th in the evening for our VentureCrushFG event, which I am very excited about who's coming, which we're not going to tell you just yet. And then we also, on December 9th, have our lunch to focus on QSBS, Qualified Small Business Stock, which a number of you asked us to talk about, Section 1202 of the tax code.
So important.
It is important.
Like, so important.
December 9th, a lunch featuring a very riveting discussion on qualified small business stock and the relevant sections and regs of the tax code, which that does impact founders, it does impact execs, it certainly impacts investors. And I know to answer your question that you're not asking, yes, I've written a whole bunch on QSBS because it's super important and complicated. I want to thank our team, Mark Kesslin, my partner, Karen Ernst, Christine Arian, Katie Davey, Brittany Harlos, Betty King, Jenny Wagner, Ingela Brondum, Nicole Stewart, and the other folks from Lowenstein who are working the event today, as well as our wonderful panel. Thank you very much, panel.